in 2006, I was 13. And in 2006, I remember being at school and no one was miserable about anything broadly. Like, no one was sitting around at school being like, the world's cooked, the world's screwed. They probably said that about climate change, right? But no one was sitting around being like, oh, the housing market's cooked, or, you know, you're never going to get a job, or your job's going to get taken by AI. Like, the existential dread that was going on all the time was just quite lacking. The degree to which a typical person nowadays is able to cruise along when it comes to their finances and just tumble their way into long-term bliss is lower. I don't like it. I wish that wasn't the case. The Aussie Fire podcast is a collaboration between Strong Money Australia and Pearler, Australia's favourite boring long-term investing platform. Join our hosts, Dave from Strong Money Australia and Hayden from Pearler, as they discuss all things financial independence. At Aussie Fire, we're big fans of sharing experiences and talking about money. However, please note that any advice is general and does not consider your financial situation, needs, or objectives. Consider whether it's appropriate for you, and if in doubt, speak to a licensed financial advisor.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Aussie Fire podcast. So today in this episode, we're going to be unpacking some common financial advice that we disagree with. And there are lots of things that we're going to be talking about today that kind of get held up as a bit of a gold standard and some smart things that you should basically always be doing. They're sort of like rules to follow, essentially, that we see commonly purported in society. But we also think that there's some of these things that are not always the right approach in many cases. So we're going to be unpacking a few of those things and kind of explaining where we don't quite agree with that as advice for everyone to be following. And it's not to say that any of it is bad advice necessarily. In many cases, it's actually quite good advice and it is smart things to do for many people, but it's just realizing when those things or when those pieces of advice might not apply to your situation. So we'll kind of unpack when those pieces of advice work best and the other times when it doesn't and when a different approach might actually work better. So hopefully as you listen along, it'll help you gain maybe a better perspective and better clarity over your own opinions around these topics and what type of situations where the advice is something that you want to follow and where you might deviate from that in your own life. And just so you know, guys, we do have quite a few of these things that we've written down to discuss today. So if we don't get to all of them, we will kind of put a pin in this one and we'll wrap it up and we will take those other topics across to the next episode. So this might very well be a little 2-part series for you.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Dave, of course, as always. I'm really interested particularly to see the ones that we disagree on. I think that'll be a little bit of fun because I know there's quite a lot that we agree on. And I know we've come to this with a few different items and a few overlapping items. And maybe we could start with a really easy one that I know we both agree on, just to warm everyone up, which is, I'll let you take away a little bit, but I believe it's around insurance.
Yeah, so I don't know if we've actually covered insurance fully on this podcast before, have we?
We have.
We have?
We haven't in a half episode, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So essentially, I would say that most people are told to basically insure almost everything in their lives. Insurance is seen as this incredibly sensible thing. It's the smart thing to do to like protect your assets and protect whatever else is going on in your life. And it's almost seen as reckless and risky if you don't have it. And you should be pretty much maximizing your insurance. Would you say that is generally the kind of purported advice across society, across most sort of categories?
Yeah, I'd say that generally speaking, if people can afford insurance, they generally get encouraged to get the insurance. The times I see people not being encouraged to get insurance, usually when it's a material cost to them. For instance, let's say they go traveling, they might get the basic option as opposed to the full option, but that's just because they don't have a ton of money sitting around. Whereas if they have, lots of money, the general advice I'd see people give is like, why would you not? Why would you not just kind of max that out or increase that? Or get the insurance, basically.
All right. So if we look across the different categories, why do you think, it's fairly easy to see why insurance is recommended because you're going to be, I suppose, preventing bad outcomes or preventing very expensive outcomes, let's say, for when those things do actually eventuate. So that kind of makes sense. And then there's also like the peace of mind factor, obviously security that comes from having insurance. So you feel a lot more comfortable when you have it versus when you don't have it. So things like that. And many times the things that we're insuring against are things that we literally can't afford to cover the loss of if it was to actually eventuate in our life. So then obviously that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, where you and I obviously have this agreement is that if you can't cover the loss of it, then of course insurance makes sense. But if you can cover the loss of it, then you just need to kind of look at the mathematics of things to see if it makes sense. Good examples of that are, I will make sure I'm insured when I travel overseas because I know that the costs of issues that can come up overseas can become quite significant. But then if you break that down further, I think medical is a much bigger part of that. So let's say you leave the country, kind of unlimited medical insurance can often be pretty important. Whereas like for a lot of people, having insurance on travel costs, like if a flight's delayed or canceled, can become less relevant much of the time because quite often airlines still sort that out, and the actual outlay that you end up having to pay if something on the logistics front goes bad is not that high. And the simple rule I usually give people is when someone, for instance, let's say someone is worried about dropping their phone and breaking it, $1,000 phone, they go, oh, should I get it insured for screen cracks? And I say, well, what are the odds you think you're going to crack your screen in the next 2 years? And they say, oh, probably like a 1% chance. I'm like, okay, well, $10 is the most you should insure it for then. And if they say, oh, it's probably like a 1 in 4 chance, I'm really clumsy. I'm like, okay, well, $250 is what you should pay for insurance. And I think that's a really easy way to gauge stuff generally, is to just try and take your best guess at the odds. And the insurance is worth it if you think it's cheaper than what the odds dictate the cost is.
And you have to be, it's interesting because you can calculate the odds yourself, but then the people on the other end who are providing the insurance have a team of statisticians who are making their own odds, right? And who are estimating based on their expected outflows, which are claims that you might make in the future. They've got all these nerd number crunchers finding out, okay, how much do we expect to pay out in claims? How much do we have to keep aside for all our operating costs, like all our staff, all our offices, all our phone centers and all this? And then how much do we have to actually price this insurance product to the point where we can pay out all of these costs and still make some money on top? And so, statistically, like you're pointing to, it is a losing bet. So if you can afford to insure certain things, it is generally better if you can do it that way. And one thing that kind of blows me away is it seems like over time, the amount of things that you can get insurance on seems to just be increasing and increasing. It used to just be mostly like, house, car, contents, whatever. And then it becomes like phones, and then it becomes appliances, and then it becomes all of these different smaller things where you can do the extended warranty and all these different things where they can add it on, and then even travel flights getting cancelled and all the rest of it. So they're being offered for a reason, these products, because they're quite profitable, right? Because the vast majority of the time, the claims are really not being made. You're protecting yourself, but they're offering it because they expect to pay out far less than what they give you back in terms of claims made.
Yeah, 100%. And the problem is insurance is complicated too. If anyone out there's ever tried to make decisions between, for instance, with vehicles, third-party insurance or comprehensive insurance, you can waste half a day reading through the product disclosure statements. If you've ever tried to make sense of private healthcare, you could have wasted 2 days going through all the product disclosure statements. It's a really convoluted space. And I think the problem is it's very natural for people to go, I don't understand this, so I might as well err on the side of caution, which is a very natural human thing, particularly because the topics of insurance themselves are often relating to things that we're nervous about already, or we're looking for some kind of protection in. So it's certainly very difficult. I really, really would encourage people to try and economize and think of these things in terms of stats. And like, just to give another example that's slightly unrelated to insurance, Dave, I was talking with someone a while ago about, I think there was some southern lights, the aurora going on near Sydney. And it was about, the drive to get somewhere to see the lights was, I think, about $30. And there's this question of like, should you pay the fuel money to go see the lights? Well, then you ask yourself, what are the odds they're actually there? Then you read up online and they say there's about a 50% chance they're going to come tonight. So you can actually make these decisions easier by doing this the other way and saying, if it's $30 for a 50% chance, you can actually ask yourself a very simple question, which is, would you pay $60 to see them? Because that's how many times you'd have to do it. So this way of thinking with money can help protect you with insurance. And again, this is always for stuff that you can afford. Usually I find that, the other area, not just stuff you can't afford, that's good for insurance, but it's also stuff where, again, the costs are kind of really wacky, or you don't exactly know how bad it's going to get. Like comprehensive car insurance for expensive cars is something that can make sense because, it could be a $40,000 or a $60,000 or an $80,000 cost depending on it. And it's a little less predictable. Whereas there are other certain expenses where you kind of know up front exactly what they're going to be. And just probably my last comment on this is be very careful of insurance that relates to consumer goods or consumer services. If you're being offered a product or a service, particularly in Australia, there are very strong consumer protection rules that exist with this stuff, Like a really good example is you go to Jetstar's website, when you go to buy a flight, it'll say something like, do you want to get complimentary travel insurance with this flight for $2? And sure, if you're doing a big trip, that's one thing. But let's just say, you're flying up for a few days, from Melbourne to Darwin to see someone. If that flight is significantly delayed or cancelled, you're entitled to refunds or compensation that's dictated by the Australian government. These things exist. Companies that offer insurance on products like washing machines and stuff, they say you've got 1 year limited warranty. Like that, this whole space itself is kind of crazy because by law in Australia, things have warranties as long as they should last. If you buy a fridge and the company you buy it off says it's a 1 year warranty, it is longer than a 1 year warranty because a reasonable person expects a fridge to last more than a year. I don't know what a fridge is. It might be 5 years or something like that. But all of these things exist, and it's really tricky because if you don't know they exist and you aren't aware of those consumer protections, when people offer you insurance, they say, you got a $1,000 fridge. Do you want to pay $50 to get, to go from a 1 year to 2 year warranty? And that's basically a form of insurance, right? You could think of warranty as extended warranty as an insurance. People want to say yes. And a lot of these extended warranties you see a lot of the time aren't really giving you more protections. They're actually simply saying to you that if you give the company money, then if you have a problem, they're going to fight you less on the things you're entitled to anyway. They're more likely just to be like, oh yeah, sure, you paid the thing. Whereas if you didn't have the thing, you can just go to them and you'll probably have to get into a little tizzle with them to get to the same result anyway. So there's so much stuff on this space and the whole space of insurance that it pays to not pay, but instead just to read or educate yourself. And in the age of LLMs like ChatGPT and things, it's actually easier than ever to get a good basic general education when it comes to these things too.
So we're kind of against going for maximum insurance just by default and kind of looking at when it makes sense and when it doesn't make sense, ideally based on, probabilities and some numbers, if you can manage to do that, like Hayden's saying, and going through some examples of what you might expect to receive in benefits versus what you're paying, rather than just assuming you need it, because that's kind of the standard approach and what most people do. So I think as you scale up it's interesting, you can look at it different ways. Like as you scale up your wealth, the things that can hurt you get less. So then naturally it makes sense that you need less of these types of insurances, whatever they might be, to the point where at some obscene end, imagine you live in or you have like a $10 million portfolio and you have a house that's worth, $1 million and you don't spend that much, right? You live a fairly simple life, but you're fairly wealthy as well at the same time. At that point, you don't really need insurance for your house burning down, because you could literally just pay $500,000 or $1 million to build a brand new house. It's not going to hurt you as such, right? And I'm not saying everyone should cancel their home insurance. It's not about that. It's just about thinking in terms of how much can this thing hurt me relative to my overall position, or would I be actually okay? So when you get to certain points in life, you realize maybe I don't actually need life insurance, and maybe I don't need income protection because maybe I have these other things in place, these other workarounds, or this wealthier position that means that I'll be fine regardless of what happens. But the tricky part is, Hayden, like those unpredictabilities where you might have something that can really blow out. Like maybe it's overseas, you get in an accident while you're traveling, and then there's all these unpredictable costs that you can't really calculate potentially in advance. So that makes it very, very difficult. And even though the chance of that is very, very tiny, which is why the insurance isn't actually that much because it's priced a certain way on purpose, it still can be potentially very, very expensive. And so you want to be wary of those things as well. So I'd say just in general, try and question things and see if you can come to a more sort of reasonable solution rather than just going for maximum insurance. And then you can always adjust your premiums by increasing your excess. Basically, you're saying, like, I'm almost going to part insure myself, right? I'm willing to chip in money if this event is to happen that I'm trying to protect against. And so you're kind of teaming up with the insurance company in a way and say, hey, if something happens, we're going to pay for it together, more or less.
100%. And don't be scared, because a lot of the time the math doesn't hurt you that much. Like, just to give you a simple example, after I had my bicycle crash, I was facing the removal of a tooth, the addition of an implant, and before that a bone graft, and then once the implant was in, a new crown. And all of that together, I think was going to cost like, maybe $6,000 or something like that. And I thought, oh my God, I should get some private insurance. I delayed this kind of treatment for a year to get past the waiting periods or something like this. I mean, this was kind of before I knew exactly what it was going to be. And like, what happened was that I ended up paying like $2,500 more in premiums over 2 years to save $3,000 in like medical fees, basically. So I saved $500 over 2 years. And I remember at the first I was like, wow, this is so good. But then I thought about it for a while and I was like, my goodness gracious, I had to like engineer this. I had to sit down, do the math, put it in Excel, and basically getting the best possible outcome I could get for that was like 16% improvement. Now, I'm not going to pretend that money's not a benefit, but that's the best engineered approach,
Yeah.
And then when I finally got all my teeth stuff sorted, I whacked down the private healthcare to something very cheap. And about 6 months later, I had to get my wisdom teeth out. And I was like, oh my God, I did that thing that Dave and Hayden are talking about. I like didn't pay for insurance I can't afford. And now I was getting this $1,500 wisdom tooth, bill. So I look up my old private healthcare, the one that gave me lots of cover, and it said that I would get like $250 back for each tooth, which was like $700. And I was like, oh my God. And how much would it have cost me to stay on that high cover? It was like $30 a fortnight for 6 months. And it's like, okay, that's $360. And it's like, oh, I should have just paid the $360 insurance to save the $700. But then when I looked closer in my like PDS, because of the other surgeries I'd already kind of gone into the caps for that year pretty heavily.
Okay. Yeah.
So I would have only saved $300 anyway. And this is a very specific one to private healthcare, but it's just like, there are many instances where, you'll think that you regret it, but then it actually turns out fine anyway. Equally, there are going to be times that you're just exceptionally glad you had it. I left a passport on a train overseas once, and the insurance was just amazing. I saved hundreds of dollars. And it was very cheap. So I'm not trying to just demonize it all together. It's more saying I think people have this image in their head of like, with insurance, there's always a great result when things go wrong. And without insurance, I'm always screwed when things go wrong.
Yes.
And the reality is it's much more 50-50. And I think you go online, you'll see people share their experiences with things like car insurance and things like, oh, I had a car crash, but the insurance company's doing this or something like that. It's always murky. So go in knowing that like, there might be maybe a good way to think about it. It's like if you get insurance on something, if you're not going to spend the time to read all the T's and C's, there's probably a 50% chance, even if you thought you needed it, that you won't get what you want from it just because there's so much nuance there.
And just following on from that, Hayden, what I find is that when it comes to insurances, people often, I think there's part of them that wants to be compensated if something bad happens to them. So it's like, okay, this thing happened, but at least I have my insurance, so I'll get XYZ. So I don't think it's necessarily, wanting it to be covered financially. I think there's almost an emotional component. They want to feel not just protected, but like some sort of emotional comfort for when a bad thing happens, someone is going to help me, or I'm going to be, compensated by the world in some way, right? In this case, it would be an insurance company. But do you know, I kind of notice this type of thinking when you talk to people about it. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, definitely. And lots of stuff's not covered. Like there's a trip I have next year in April, taking leave from work. And I was talking to my colleague and we were talking about I might have to cancel that trip because of a very serious thing we have to do at work. And I was like, oh, that's fine. I'm sure travel insurance covers it. It's like, doesn't, I think it's the Allianz travel insurance only covers if you have to cancel leave because work asked you to, if it's related to if you're in the fire brigade or something like that. Basically, if you're in like an emergency service where like there's like bushfires and you're like, oh, I guess I can't go to France kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that. Like even I, as someone who had insurance for travel stuff, I was like, oh, damn, okay, I guess that's not going to help me there.
I've also noticed a couple of people that I've known personally who've had insurance for contents in their house, which is fine, and they could afford not to. So that's kind of like a side matter, but they had this contents insurance for their stuff in their house. And part of it was because they had some sentimental possessions and some maybe a grandmother's ring or something of this sort of nature. And so they wanted to insure those things to protect them. And so when I had a conversation with these people, it's like then they weren't necessarily protecting the monetary value because it wasn't that high. They were more or less, it was like this psychological thing where they want to be compensated if they were to lose something that was of sentimental value. Because if you have a house fire and those things were destroyed and burned, you can't replace them. So the money you get that you're being compensated for them it's not really good enough in a way, right? You're getting something which feels better than nothing, but at the same time, those things aren't replaceable. So then is it really worth insuring them if you can afford to not have the insurance and you can afford to replace, the rest of your contents with your savings or whatever. So I find that there's also an element of that in there as well.
I agree. I'm one of those people that is just perpetually worried about the house burning down or someone breaking in. My quick 3 tips for people on that topic: you can go buy fire bags online on eBay and Amazon, which are like fireproof bags in the case of house fire. In terms of security, these days you can go buy $30 or $40 cameras that run on Wi-Fi that you can just put in your hallway or something that makes sounds if it detects motion whilst you're away. And then thirdly, there are lots of really great apps out there where you can actually really quickly take photos or scans of things. I had a whole bunch of primary school books I found, and I was like, oh man, this would really suck if all this childhood thing I had, got destroyed in a house fire. So I found an app on my phone, and I just put my phone on the side of a table, and it would just detect when you put something under it. And I just sat there for 3 hours on a Sunday night, just flipping pages through books. And now I have it all in a Google Drive or something, which I know to a lot of people sounds a little unhinged, which I fully respect that view of. But it's more just that in a way to me is insurance, because I'm well, if I for some reason lose that one day due to a house fire or a flood, I think they're in the garage, which is below ground. It's that's okay. At least I have the photos. I'm not sitting around being what's this with contents? Because a lot of stuff, as Dave said, you can't really replace it. And also the complexities of fighting insurance companies on that stuff is complicated as well. So hopefully that helps anyone who's been sitting around worried about fire, theft, or just general destruction of contents.
All right, mate. So let's switch off from insurance and we'll pivot to personal finance. So I want to talk to you about the bucketing system, or I think people think of it like the barefoot approach to managing your personal finances. And this is essentially where you'll take a certain percentage of your pay and you put it in one bank account for this area of life, maybe your basic bills that you have to pay, your non-negotiables, and then you have a certain percentage allocated in another area, and that'll be for fun, and then a certain percentage over here, and that'll be allocated for long-term savings or maybe a holiday or investing or something like that. So what do you think about the percentage-based approach to personal finance? Because I don't know if you've ever followed it personally, but I've after I learned about it, I'm I see why it works for some people, but it's definitely not for me. I just don't like the rigidity of it. I don't like the arbitrary nature of having a percentage here and a percentage there. I would rather just have all of my money in one place rather than have 4 or 5 different bank accounts and then decide what I spend the money on, whether it's more of it goes into housing or less of it goes into splurging or fun money or whatever it is. So I just don't like the arbitrary nature of the percentages. I don't mind the idea of a dollar-based approach, maybe where you're okay, I've got all of these expenses. Let me just set aside X amount per month. And that's kind of my fun spending account. I think that makes more sense than percentages here and there, because they're kind of arbitrary. You're making them up, and it can, if for someone who's a bit more frugal by nature and a bit more maybe freedom oriented, yeah, I really kind of don't like that forced structure, but I understand why it works for a lot of people, because they need that saving element, having 10% put into savings or 20%, otherwise it just won't happen.
I don't have a big negativity towards it. I think that it probably doesn't work for everyone. Like it works, I think, really well for people with stable incomes, probably. But then the percentages just essentially act as like dollar amounts anyway. I mean, my take on a lot of this stuff is like you collect money every week, month, or fortnight. You pay what you need to pay with that. And then anything that's left over gets put towards the future. But obviously for a lot of people without that rigidity of like, I need to save X percent of my income, that'll just slip into the abyss and they'll just keep tapping into that extra amount of money. So in some senses, I think at the very least, I think it's always worth people having a target savings rate. Is like a simple idea. It's like, if you know your income, you should be like, I get this much money after tax every month. Therefore, I should, I want to save 25% of it. Great. That means that, either this month I can save this much or across the year I can save this much. I think one probably just caveat I'd add to this stuff is like, I like the general principle of the buckets, though I think it's really good to look at these things over the course of a year. I think it's really good to say this year I intend to have invested X dollars, and this year I intend to, I want to have a fun fund or a fun bucket of X dollars, because I think for a typical person, they have to make decisions over a longer period of time, because there are quiet months. There are months where, if you have unstable income, you'll have more or less money. There are months where you might want to have fun. You might not want to, fill up a bucket with something, tap into a bucket this particular month or something like that. So I probably in some way agree with you in the sense that I don't think people need to take it religiously, but I do think that a typical person, which I probably am not a typical person in this regard, but a typical person needs some kind of schema, structure, framework to discipline themselves, whatever that is. And maybe the buckets works for them.
No, I do agree with that. And I agree with it that it's an approach that works. So where I'm just differing from it is that if you're more of I think people should, if they can, it's great in the beginning, but then it's also better if you can move towards a more of a mindfulness approach where you're like, okay, all my money's coming in, I've got these bills. And then for the money that's left over after that, it's optional what I do with it. So what am I going to do with it? So, and then I would like to look at each sort of purchase that I'm making and think thoughtfully about it and be like, is this really worth it or is it not? Like, what is it adding to my life, rather than just having, okay, here's my set amount each month for spending, because then it just leads to like forced spending, basically like forced savings, because you're like, well, the money's there in my spending account, I might as well spend it. So I don't know, man. I've never been like maybe my target savings rate was always like more than whatever it is now. It was always more, right? I wanted to save more so I didn't really have a target dollar amount. It was just like, let me just minimize my expenses by being very thoughtful about what I'm choosing to spend on and why I'm doing it. And does it make sense? And continually kind of recalibrating what I was doing with my money. So I think that it can be better if you can move eventually towards that sort of an approach. Otherwise it's kind of like guardrails. Like you're 10-pin bowling with the guardrails up. It's good if you can take them down at some point and bowl by yourself.
I mean, I think it's more relaxing. I don't think I haven't checked my bank balance before I bought groceries in like 8 years. I don't know what I spend on groceries, to be perfectly honest. I don't know what I spend on food at the moment. I could do some math or something on it, but that's just because my approach is spend as little as I can and whatever's left is left. But to your point, you kind of evolve into that to some extent. Like in the early days, it's useful to have that, particularly when you have very little money to save. But then also, like when I think about the time when I maybe wanted to save or invest and I didn't have much money, I wasn't dealing with buckets. I was just spending what I needed to and spending my spare time not worrying about buckets, but instead worrying about how do I spend less? Do I really need Netflix? Is there a cheaper place to buy groceries? Oh, I should shop at Aldi this week and see what happens. Which for a typical person that doesn't really have much money left over to save might be a better use of their time potentially. But, I guess the point we're making here is just that there are many different avenues that work.
Yeah, as you're saying, mate, I think it is something that you do kind of naturally evolve into, especially if you're someone who is, both ways. If you're someone who's more frugal in nature, you won't need the buckets at all to begin with, because you'll just naturally question kind of everything you're doing and try and save more than what you're currently saving, just as a habit of being somewhat of an optimizer. And so you'll naturally be like this mindful type spender that I'm kind of describing. And if you're someone who's, let's say, a more of a regular person, then you'll use the buckets initially. That will work really well to get you in the habit of the forced discipline of money disappearing from your bank account, going into savings or going into your mortgage or investments or whatever. And then hopefully over time, you can be more of a self-questioner on where your money's going and what you're really getting for it and whether you need different things in your life or whether you can, optimize further and nail down exactly making sure that you're getting maximum value for where your money's going. So there's that as well. But I find, funnily enough, that as you progress up the scale and you become wealthier, if you are a more frugal person, you can sometimes fall into the trap of basically never wanting to spend, right? Because you become so kind of passionate about your frugality that it becomes hard to pull back from that at all, even if you've got like tons of surplus cash, let's say. So in some ways, then you could reintroduce a bucket for that person to say, okay, I'm having trouble spending just because of my inbuilt habits at this point. So let me allocate $3,000 a year or $5,000 a year or whatever, and let me use that to kind of enjoy myself and enjoy the wealthier position that I've created here. Because otherwise I might find myself kind of never allowing myself to enjoy certain things just out of pure habit of saving too much rather than the opposite of a beginner spending too much and needing that same sort of discipline. So it's quite interesting. You can almost come full circle.
I agree with that. I think fun funds are great things. I think the people who are frugal tend to be over analytical with their spending. And the best way to solve that is to put a forced amount of money to spend on stuff. Don't itemize your fun spending, because in a vacuum, you'll be able to argue that everything needs to go away. Let's say you've got $500,000 in savings or liquid assets, whatever. So, you're 40, you've got $500,000 and you've got an annual income of $120,000 a year. Great. Okay. We'll put aside $5,000 a year. Okay. 1% of your net worth in those terms, or maybe, 1 and a tiny bit percent of your take home pay. All right. So that's $5,000 a year. That's $20 a week. What is that? $100 a week. Great. Spend on that whatever you want. Netflix, trips, heated seats. If you buy a new car, doesn't really matter. Because once that budget's kind of been set there and once you've committed yourself to not being allowed to necessarily reinvest that, I think it can do wonders for people's mentalities. Yeah, it's interesting. It's good that you raise that, actually. I like to look at things always in proportion to your situation. So like that $5,000, adding extra fund money, $5,000, that would be terrible for someone at the beginning of their journey who's, struggling to save, or all they can save is $5,000 or $10,000. But for someone who's got this big surplus later, that's not going to be much at all relative to their income and relative to their wealth. So it's going to be a tiny proportion. And so as you scale up your wealth over time, you can increase your spending while still having it be a very, very low percentage of maybe your income if you're still working, or of your wealth if you're retired. So it's just an interesting way to look at it. And I think it's more helpful, especially when it comes to kind of breaking out of overly aggressive savings habits, perhaps. Yeah, 100%. Totally agree with that. I think that's a great idea. All right, so let's move on to the next one, Dave. This one's one of mine that I brought in, which is essentially the financial advice I disagree with is the relevance of work-life balance or following your dreams in its totality when it comes to when you make financial decisions. I think the world is too difficult for that these days, to be perfectly blunt. I think that no one should be unhealthy. Maybe a way to phrase it is that the idea of work-life balance, if you think about it, is saying, you should go do work and then you should just have this amazing life outside of work. And what I would say to young people is that I more shift that in my head as you should go do your work. And then outside of work, you should be healthy enough, so to speak, in terms of you shouldn't be suffering from crippling anxiety or depression because of work. You shouldn't be, sleep deprivation because of work. But for a typical young person these days, you can't afford to just be I'm Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday is I'm out socializing, having a ton of fun, when 2 of those things would be more than enough just to keep you going. It's it's just too hard, and this isn't some kind of Stockholm syndrome, I'm just grumpy. It's I've been very lucky and been able to have a lot of amazing experiences in my 20s, but it's just difficult. And I particularly, for anyone listening to this, I particularly feel bad for there's this generation that are roughly between the ages of 27 to maybe 35 or 37, because, and hear me out, I'm 32, right? And I broadly attribute the world getting worse to sometime around when Obama got into office, not because of Obama, to be clear, but like the GFC happened in 2008, which most Australians didn't feel. But then also that kind of set the world on a weird tone. And then a lot of the kind of political uprising started to happen around that time. And then a lot of social media problems started to happen around that time. Like you can kind of point to around that period as where things started to get tougher. And then at various points for different groups of people, it has just been tougher since then in the Western world in Australia. And the thing is, when, in 2006, I was 13. And in 2006, I remember being at school, and some people listening on this might be able to relate, and some of the young people might find this funny. No one was miserable about anything broadly. Like no one was sitting around at school being like, the world's cooked, the world's screwed. They probably said that about climate change, right? But no one was sitting around being like, oh, the housing market's cooked, or, you're never going to get a job, or your job's going to get taken by AI. Like the existential dread that was going on all the time was just quite lacking. There were problems, of course, but nowadays it's like you talk to young people, and I work with a lot of young people at university, 18, 19, all the way through to 24. They're so bleak about the future because they were going through high school during COVID. They were going through high school during the recession. They were going through high school during the housing boom of the 2010s, where they knew they weren't going to probably own property in major cities. And I think what's difficult is a lot of young people have been raised by parents who a lot of the time really overemphasize this whole like, don't push yourself, it'll be okay in the end. And I'm not saying that's not true. Most people do have a way to find out they're okay. But it's just like the degree to which a typical person nowadays is able to cruise along or coast along when it comes to their finances and just tumble their way into, long-term bliss is lower. I don't like it. I wish that wasn't the case. But I just think that sometimes that stuff's overstated. And it's like what I would say to young people is like, the world's tough right now. It's probably tougher for you in net over the long-term finances than it is for your parents. So you need to, as much as you can without hurting your health or your well-being or your like long-term longevity, focus on that. And I do just want to point this out because I know we have some older people here too. It's difficult for young people to easily build capital. It's not difficult for young people to live, right? Like rentals are expensive, but by large measures, most consumables we buy as young people are like cheaper than ever. It's cheaper to travel. It's cheaper to, like, even groceries have gone up. It's cheaper to find things and find deals and get stuff online. Like from a consumerist perspective, things are pretty good. But the problem is like what really seems to, for a typical Australian, maybe not Dave and I, but a typical person, have the biggest impact over the long term is like, do you have secure access to capital? And a lot of our parents, if you're under kind of 40 listening to this, manage to figure out the capital side of their lives pretty well. So now they might be like 60 or so, they're in their house that they bought for 2x their income, they're okay. And that brings them a great deal of peace and comfort and security for a typical person. So I'm not trying to point out that like everything's harder for a young person. I think it's just getting access to that, in particular housing security, while still having capital around to pay the bills and look after yourself is difficult. So just don't let someone tell you that it's all about, choosing your favorite job. And just as an example, I do what I like, right? Like I have a salary. I could go do things that get me that I like less for like 1.2, 1.3x the money. I don't do that because I like what I do. However, when I talk to young people in computer science, there are jobs you can get in computer science, Dave, if you're a smart cookie, that like out of university pay you $400,000 a year.
Oof.
And I talk to these young kids and they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm into that stuff. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. My dad works in not construction, but like in building. He's a tradie. He works in building solar farms basically with his hands. And like, he says that he has young people coming and earning like tons of money in like the blue collar labor force in FIFO work. And he just sees them spend huge amounts of money on cars and Porsches and stuff. And he's like just shaking them, being like, you have no idea what a leg up you have as like a 19-year-old. So anyway, this has been an exceptionally long ramble. But the point is, if you're young, the world is not necessarily very nice to young people in the Western world in terms of your long-term capital situation. Don't overindulge in these critical years. Take it seriously, and you'll be thankful in your 30s and 40s that you did a lot of good things in your 20s for yourself.
No, I think there's a lot of good points in there, mate. It's super interesting because I'm imagining there's like a push-pull at play here, right? Because on one hand, you've got things that are more difficult, but on the other hand, you've got advice that's like, do what you love, follow your dreams, work-life balance, which kind of then makes it more difficult again if you're facing sort of an uphill battle in certain other areas, right?
Yeah, for sure. But I think the main point is there's a difference between sacrificing income for a thriving social leisure life versus sacrificing income to look after yourself. That's the delineation I think is like super important. Like, I don't like being tired or depressed. I don't like being miserable, and I'll give up income. I'll spend money to avoid that, and everyone should broadly. But I tell people all the time, it's like, I've mentioned on this podcast a few times that, I have more than enough money that I could go traveling the world for months a year. I have no children. I've been saving up for 10 years. But most of the time I ever go traveling, I'm like working in some way, even if it's on content or media. And it's like, people tell me, oh, you should just take a break. And I'm like, yeah, but life's pretty good. I don't need, life's fine. I'm okay. I don't need to be like, maximize the leisure out of it at the expense of further opportunities I have to solidify my financial position in this increasingly uncertain world. So, this is an advice from someone who just works 24 hours a day. It's just
23.
I've had two jobs for a long time. I teach at the uni, right? And they always ask me, they're like, when are you going to stop? And I'm like, probably when I have kids. Because a lot of people with kids lose a lot of time to their kids for good reason. And it's like, if you're a young person without children right now, you have so much time. You just have so much time. And unless you have one of those really difficult jobs where they're working you really hard, or you're doing shift work or something that's physically taxing, you have spare time to try and find other ways to further your financial position. And that doesn't have to be side gigs. That can also be self-development or improvement. So you can get that pay rise quicker. So you can get that promotion quicker, so that when you turn up to your actual job, you can actually solidify that position better. But it's so difficult in Australia because Australia has the tall poppy syndrome problem, right? On a weekly basis, on a 3-4 times a week, an individual for the last 10 years has said to me, you work too much, Hayden, you do this too much. And some of them is said because they care about me. But a lot of the time they just say that because they're not doing it, And I do it to other people too sometimes. And we all do it to each other in Australia as a general rule. It's so easy to be like, if I'm not making the effort, then other people making the effort is hard, is silly. And that's a really difficult thing for a young person to look past when they get given advice. Like, you need to not do this. You need to slow down. You need to stop worrying so much. You need to stop caring so much. It's like, back yourself, because lots of other people are not going to, because they'll just be slightly low-key frustrated that, you're not doing that. I'm sure Dave, Dave, by all accounts, is a very happy, functioning adult. Dave's in his 30s. He doesn't have to work anymore. He enjoys his days. And I guarantee you, if I just randomly went and told someone who's 40, who has a full-time job, about Dave's situation, 50% of them would find a way to critique him straight away. And I'm sure sorry, talking about you like you're not here. I'm sure you've seen that, right?
Yeah.
It's just people are so good at bringing you down. So back yourself when it comes to shoring up your own future. And
when you are at a young age, you're don't underestimate or don't fail to appreciate just how much energy you have relative to how much energy you're going to have 10 years from now. Your capacity to work and to think and to problem solve and to do difficult things is not really going to increase after age 30, right? It's probably going to go down. Your energy levels when you're 18 to 25, 27, 29 are so high that you can work long days and still have energy after that. And I did that. I had a somewhat physical job as well. So you need to make the most, I think, of that time where you are kind of in your peak physical health, let's say, because you do have the capacity to work harder than the average adult. So you need to take advantage of that and then to use that to kind of build, you're building the idea, because all of the benefits, if you can front load the work, the benefits compound forever. That's the part that I was thinking on when I was in my 20s. If I just work hard now, and if I just work hard and save hard and do all of these right things, then that's going to compound for the rest of my life. And it absolutely does. Like, there's no better opportunity than someone who's young and is able to maybe do a job that they don't necessarily like, to Hayden's point earlier about these these young graduates who are able to step into pretty good incomes, and they're like, I don't really want to do that job. Like, we have a lot of those high income jobs here, like in FIFO in WA, and the people don't necessarily...
That's all the jobs in WA, right?
Yeah.
Just mines.
The people don't necessarily want to do it forever, but it can make a huge difference to your financial future if you're able to front load hard work and front load saving. And you don't necessarily have to go without, spending time with friends and looking after your health, like Hayden said. Like, you don't have to be crazy about it, but I think the point is pretty clear. Like, if you can front load those things, the benefits just compound massively 10 years later, 15 years later.
For sure. And 2 quick points on what Dave said. Number one, the point about one of the moments I started working very hard again in my 20s was when I went to Google and I wrote 1 times 1.05 to the power of 30, which is basically saying at a 5% return over 30 years, what does $1 turn into? And the answer is about $4. And 5% is a reasonable kind of like decent performing, post-inflation figure of growth, call it, right? You can have your opinion about that. But I remember thinking, I was like, damn, if I'm 25, that means I can either earn $1 now, or I can try and earn that $1 when I'm 55, but I have to earn 4 of them, And I think that's so powerful, because I think as well in my early 20s, I did a lot of stuff not for money. Like, I pretty much was broke for like 4 years of my 20s because I was trying to learn, which was great. But I think a big part of it was in my head. I was always like, I'll just earn the money later. That's such a tricky mentality to get into, because I'm like, oh, it's fine. I'll go do all the fun stuff here. Because like, okay, I spend 20 grand this year. That's fine. I'll just earn 20 grand in 5 years and it'll all net out, when I'm later. And it's like the dollars aren't the same. And you have to account for the timing parameter of the dollar, right? Like, a dollar is timed and that timing is relevant. Secondly, on Dave's thing about when you're younger, you have more energy. I've learned this recently. When you're older, it's not that you even have less energy, you just have less capacity to even save money. Like, for instance, recently, there was a place I was, and I wanted to get from place A to place B. And it was about, 700 kilometers. And I was like, I could fly, but if I had to fly, it's going to cost me $150 on the plane, and then I'm going to need a hotel when I get there for the night, because it was kind of like a transit thing. And I was like, oh, the hotel's going to be another $150. And I was like, oh my God, that's $300. Fuck, it's a lot of money. But then I was like, aha, I found like a bus, think like a Greyhound bus that was like overnight. That was like $50. And I was like, oh, just hop on the bus. $50, save $250,
It's good money.
And I did it. And it's not that I regret it, but I like couldn't move my neck properly for like 3 days after. And like, I think this is a deeper problem around how much I don't stretch, but I just remember being like, man, if I was 22 instead of 32, I would have just got off that bus and been like,
fresh,
running around. Yeah. So expenses do inherently go up as you get older for whatever reason, depending on whatever person. So it's a great time when you're young too, because you can actually do silly things to save money.
That's a good point.
I'm not saying you should, but...
No. That's a really good point, because I forgot to say this before, but you're also like, you have that kind of lifestyle flexibility or that lifestyle adaptability to where, it's kind of famous at this point where young people, like, they'll live in a share house and they'll eat 2-minute noodles and whatever. And you're happy with that. You don't really care, because that's basically your baseline after you move out from home. So if you're able to kind of stretch that time period out, for as long as possible while you're building your capital on the side, then that can make a massive difference as well because once that lifestyle inflation starts kicking in, you don't want to ratchet it down. So you want to do it slower than the average person. Not that you can't do it, but you want to limit it and just only allow yourself little bits of that inflation over time. And then when you're older and you're in a wealthier position, then you can indulge in more things like that. But you need to take advantage of that kind of more flexible, more adaptable sort of situation that you have for yourself when you are at a young age, whether it's 18 to 25 or whatever, because that can make a massive difference as well. And when you combine it with the work capacity and the lifestyle simplicity, then you can really make some pretty big progress.
100%. And my last comment on this would be, this doesn't just apply to this topic, but you're allowed to do something that you think you shouldn't do and that be okay while still aiming to do better. Like, I like food, and I know right now I'll go buy, a $22 meal takeaway and bring it home, which I know some people listening might consider that a lot of money. Not a lot of money. And some will consider it a lot, and I consider it a lot, And I'll know that there's cheaper options out there. I'll know that there's some place that sells a bunch of dumplings that are equally healthy and half the price, but I don't want the dumplings. I want this other thing. And that's okay that I get it. I don't have to hate myself for it, but I can also get it and be like, this is probably not ideal. And I think a common thing I see with young people is frankly, everyone, but it's probably most impactful for young people to think about it as like, they will go and do something they isn't the most financially responsible thing, but they can't deal with the fact that it's not a good thing. So they convince themselves it is a good thing. Good example might be like they go on a holiday and they spend $400 on a hotel because they really need a nice hotel to feel safe, right? I'm not trying to be negative about that, right? Everyone has different things that they like. But it's like, instead of just being like, I really need this hotel to feel safe and that's why I'm going to do it. But also being able to acknowledge like, I probably shouldn't do this. I should probably work on figuring out how to, be a little more resilient with this stuff. They just convince themselves that it's so necessary and that to challenge that is it's such a bad idea, because naturally, like, to challenge it would then to hold those two things in your head is really hard. Like, it's just psychologically very difficult. And it's such a pivotal step, I think, in terms of like financial growth in general, because you need to be able to spend money on stuff that is silly. Like, I spend money on stuff all the time that I shouldn't, and then still know that you want to change without hating yourself for it. Because for a lot of us, if we know we want to change something, we just hate ourselves for it. The most obvious example for me is like, I use a lot of those plastic bags, those little Ziploc bags. Like, I know I shouldn't do that. If someone's like, why do you have all these Ziploc bags? I'm like, I shouldn't. It's a lot of waste. There's other solutions. I'm not strong enough right now to wash glassware. I need to use these plastic bags. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's admirable. I admire someone who doesn't, and I will get there eventually. And that's the path I want to head on. And I don't hate myself now, and I don't punch myself every time I use it. That's like the kind of mentality you need to apply to so much in order to be okay with yourself and also grow.
All right, mate. So let's pivot now from talking about younger people's issues to talking about older people's issues. So one of the things that I've seen that is quite common advice and fairly standard across the finance industry is that you should, with your investments, you should reduce risk as you age, essentially, right? So I've often seen it said, usually on US type financial blogs and things like that there's this old piece of wisdom where you should have your age in bonds as part of your portfolio allocation. So that would be like, if you're 50 years old, you have 50% in bonds. And if you're 20 years old, you have 20% in bonds, something like that, right? The general rule is that you have a small allocation to bonds. And then as you get older, you're 40, 50, 60, 70, you increase that allocation to reduce your risk as you age, because you're then in your retirement stage, you're wanting to live off the portfolio. So the idea is that you want that portfolio to be less volatile and less susceptible to kind of decent sized market falls, so that when you are withdrawing from the portfolio and selling down, that it's going to hurt you less. So I'm not the biggest fan of this kind of philosophy or this strategy. I'm not sure if you've seen this mentioned on the internet in different places, just the idea of generally reducing risk for older people, and what you think of it in general.
I have seen it. I have heard that one you mentioned, which is funny. I probably just have a simple view on it, Dave, which is that every investment has a purpose. And so every time you invest, you do it for a purpose. And every investment thing you invest in has a time horizon. And those two things just need to make sense. So bonds have short time horizons, fixed interest or, savings accounts have time horizons. ETFs have longer time horizons. That's the period in which, like, the minimum recommended holding period. If you invest in startups or startup companies like Uber, that's way longer than ETFs. They don't think you're going to get your money's worth over a 7-year period. It's going to be longer than that. And so in a sense, I agree with you, Dave, that the reduced risk as you age thing can be bad, in the sense that if you're building a portfolio now, most young people don't have anything in bonds. And if you're 60 and you still have a portfolio and you know that most of the money in that portfolio isn't going to be utilized for 10 or 20 years, why would you have anything more than the money you need in the short term in bonds or other kinds of safe assets? Like, it's a simple thing. It's like, what's this bucket of money for? Find the right investment for it. And this actually comes up a lot for us now that we have our Home Soon product on Pearler. Hashtag not an ad, seriously. Because like people basically save for their first home in their super fund. And we actually encourage people to be like, maybe bonds are interesting for a first home deposit. Because like if you're literally saving it for 2 years, then like cool. But super's 30 years. So like why would you choose a bond investment there? So I think as long as the time horizons work out. Do you think that makes sense, or do you think there's more nuance to it?
I do think that makes sense. The part where I see people thinking about it in a way where I'm like, I don't know about that, is where they somehow seem to think, okay, I'm approaching 60. I really need to like massively increase my sort of cash or bonds allocation and massively reduce my risk because now I'm in retirement stage. But if you're thinking about when you're going to be using that money, because they think, okay, well, if I retire at 60 and then the market crashes, then that's really bad. And in theory, yes, it's bad if the market crashes when you're reliant on the portfolio. But as we've talked about in other episodes, you can have other sort of backup plans, right? Where you have some cash and you spend a bit more flexibly if the market was to, have a nasty downturn and that sort of thing. But when you're 60, you're most likely dealing with the time frame of like 20 to 30 years, maybe more than 30 years. So the idea that you don't need massive amounts of growth assets, I think is completely false because you do. Like sometimes people think of it like, okay, well, I need lots of safe assets because that's going to help me like protect my retirement for longer. But I actually see it the other way where the more growth assets you have relative to what you need, the longer you can hold those growth assets, the more likely you are to be able to fund your like golden years, let's say, to the best of your ability and have a better standard of life over those remaining few decades, rather than if you really dial back the risk lever and take a way more cautious approach. It's just going to lead to lower returns over multiple decades. So I disagree with that in general. And for a young person especially, I mean, when you do the numbers on a young person starting work and they're 20 years old and they're getting employment contributions into their super and they're in a default fund and their default super fund has like 25% low risk assets or 20% like cash and fixed interest and stuff, over the course of their life, it's going to result in like $1 million less in their portfolio or whatever when they retire. I did the numbers on this a month or two ago, actually. Like that's just an enormous amount. And there's no real tangible benefit to having bonds in your portfolio at that younger age where you're not even going to be touching the money for like the next 30 years. It just doesn't make sense whatsoever. And then even when you are in those older decades, 40, 50, 60, it still doesn't make sense to have very much at all, right? I think you can have like a few years worth of spending buffer and just be a little bit flexible, and that will see you through a lot of the way and through some pretty harsh downturns. And I wrote an article about that back in the day on the blog called Your Flex Rate. And if you want to go to my website, if you type that in, it'll come up basically, but flex rate, where the more flexible you are and whatever you build into your situation, you can judge how long your portfolio will last. And a little bit of flexibility goes a massively long way to ensuring your portfolio lasts a very long time. So I'm just not the biggest fan of this sort of philosophy.
I think that makes sense. I mean, another way I'd think about it is if you're 30 right now and you knew you were going to die at 60, would you take your entire portfolio and put it into bonds?
Okay. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Like probably not, because you need it to grow or you want it to grow. And you also aren't going to use a lot of that money when you're 60 till you're 60, which I think is still the crux of it, is like when you turn 60 and you retire, sure, take the next, like you can think about it very mathematically if you want. Let's imagine that you're 60 and you expect to live till 90 and that you have ETFs, and the ETF holding period is 7 years. The recommended holding period is 7 years. That means that, there's going to be 28 years basically till you die. So 7 years is a quarter of that time period. So you could look at it and go, well, okay, I've got $1 million in ETFs. ETF holding period 7 years. I'm going to take a quarter of that money and I'm going to turn that into bonds, because the rest of the money is like on a good long time horizon. And a quarter of that money I need in the next 7 years, and I want to protect against market volatility. Okay. And then every year after that, you could then just take 1/28 of the money you have in ETFs or had in ETFs and just turn that into bonds. Like that's if you wanted to be very robotic about it. And, as long as you make sure that that recommended holding period. And I mean, the recommended holding period could sometimes not be enough, or it's often probably too long. Like that's just them trying to give you a good benchmark. You could do it like that, and then suddenly it's like, yeah, well, that makes sense, because your aim isn't to protect your portfolio. Your aim is to protect the money that you need in your portfolio that's at risk based on its risk profile.
I think one thing maybe people forget is like for a decent amount of the last century, bonds had much better income returns than they have in the 21st century. So it's also a different investment environment where we have much lower interest rates and yields now. So you can't really be getting a 8-9% bond yield each year, which is going to be very useful in terms of paying your bills. So things are a little bit different in that regard as well. So yeah, there's obviously also another element where you basically want to maximize the amount of growth assets you hold while also minimizing the amount of stress you experience for owning those assets within your particular situation. So obviously when you're more reliant on the portfolio, that can make it more stressful. So then maybe you do need more cash or more low risk investments to feel comfortable with it, not necessarily to like optimize the long-term outcome, but just from a psychological standpoint, that can make sense as well. But yeah, just as a general rule, I would not fully agree with just as a principle that you should take less risk as you age.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes sense that this comes from you, Dave, given that, you've had those problems aging recently into retirement.
Exactly. So yeah, the other situations is probably where you don't mind getting lower returns and you're in retirement, you can accept like the return hit and you don't mind too much, or you have, let's say, more than enough wealth and more than enough income where you don't need to take that extra risk, and so your appetite for risk basically goes down. So it's interesting. You can look at it a couple of ways. You can get to a point where you have enough wealth and then you live off that wealth, and then any extra above that, you can either choose to take less risk with that, the same amount of risk with that, or more risk with that. So I recently changed my super to geared super, and I had a person or two was like, but why would you do that? You don't really need the money. And then to my pushback to that is, but why not? I click 3 buttons on a screen and now I expect to get a much better outcome over the next 30 years to the point when I can reach the money.
But my question to you there would be, is all your portfolio geared?
Only my super portfolio.
Oh, sorry, just your super. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I've chosen to take more risk with that pot of money because I see it as sort of like an interesting experiment for one. I also find it more fun to try and juice the outcome rather than just leave it where it was or take less risk with it. Plus, I'm also not reliant on it either. So it's not going to stress me out, or it's not going to really negatively affect me if it doesn't work out as well as I expect it to, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you could also argue that you might want to gear your non-super stuff, some of it, right? Because some of your non-super stuff you're going to not utilize for another 10 or 15 years anyway.
Potentially. I haven't really thought about that.
If you thought it was a good long-term return option kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a possibility. I think one of the questions I had was, would you do this with your normal FI portfolio? And the answer is probably not if I was reliant on it, just due to the nature of gearing. We're kind of getting off topic now, but just because of the way gearing works, if I was reliant on the portfolio and the portfolio is being depleted heavily, like in a downturn, right, then I'm going to start eating into that a lot more quickly. So it's going to be a lot more stressful and it's going to do a lot more damage long term. So it's not really optimal from an FI portfolio standpoint if the whole portfolio was kind of geared and you needed to sell it as well. You don't want to be a forced seller of geared funds. That's just going to create a disastrous outcome, I would say. But back to the aging thing, I would say the higher bonds or the higher low risk allocation does make sense if you're going to be depleting a large amount of the portfolio. Then having less of it in the market can make it last longer because your time frame is naturally smaller, to your point, Hayden.
Yep. So I think we'll put a pin in that one, Dave. We're going to break this up into a part 2 episode coming up in the next series of weeks as well. Hopefully this has been interesting for people. Obviously, what we've talked about today is just our own thoughts. One of the greatest things about this topic is that we hope we have maybe not equal, but we hope we have a number of listeners who hear what we've talked about today and take a lot away from it and think they're great points. And we also love to have people who hear what we have to say and think we've missed a bunch of stuff, and we love to hear about that in the comments or email us. We're always happy to talk to our listeners. And on that topic, if you do have any questions that you'd like answered by Dave and I on the podcast, there are links in the show notes. And if you have any case studies, like your personal situation that you think you might want to unpack by joining us on the podcast, you can also follow another link in the show notes. But if you just like to generally contact us that aren't related to essentially questions or appearing on the podcast, you can reach out to us at hello@aussiefirepod.com, or alternatively reach out to Dave on socials at Strong Money Australia or myself at Perla. Otherwise, thank you for listening. We always appreciate your time. Hope you're having a great and wonderful day, and we'll catch you soon.
See you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Aussie Fire. For more FI inspiration, head to Perla.com to browse our resources, calculators, and community insights. Perla is an authorized representative number 1281540 of Sandland Private Wealth Pty Ltd with AFSL number 337927. Knowledge is power, especially when investing. So always seek advice and/or check out the relevant disclosure document for any financial product, including the PDS and TMD before deciding. These are available from the product issuer's website. When you invest, your capital is at risk, and past performance is not a reliable indicator of future investment returns.